So you're watching the footy?
Not really.
Never been a big footy fan.
I was back in the day.
Back in the day. What was your team back in the day?
I used to follow Shrewsbury.
Did you?
Yeah, like when they were at the old Gay Meadow.
Yeah.
Original hardcore pitch
corridor
invader.
Outside, going to get the ball out the river.
So
you're following the World Cup?
Euros.
I
think we're betraying our lack of football knowledge here.
Exactly.
But we have got an office sweepstake.
We have.
So
it doesn't. I don't even know what teams I've got in the office. I think I might have got Romania. I got some no hope of teams. All respect to Romania. But
so I think, Pete's shaking his head in the corner over there. Because he actually probably does follow the football.
He does.
He knows what he's talking about.
Bolton
and he's saying,
definitely
mighty Bolton Wanderers. But I've got England, Denmark, Slovakia and Ukraine. And I'm led to believe that 3 of those are in the same group, which made me think, actually, it's kind of increasing my odds a little bit. I don't really know anything about the relative.
Well, you're going to get one that gets out of the group stage, then, aren't you?
Definitely one out of the group,
maybe
possibly 2. And if I get 2 out of the group, they're going to go down different legs of the tournament, aren't they?
Halves, yeah.
So
have you worked out your odds?
No.
Well, I work on the basis that I never win sweepstakes, so just give my 10
donating the money to.
I saw a great Instagram post the other day saying that England were 6-1 to win the Euros. So if you put 20 quid on, you'll lose 20 quid. I think, well, that's probably nothing ever truer said.
Well,
who knows? My words.
Maybe it's coming home.
I'm sure.
Who knows? Every year, every time there's a tournament, the same fever grips the nation.
It's worth a lot to the economy. Billions, apparently. Not just extra beer drunk, but it gets everybody positive. Just like that other event coming up on 4th of July that I'm sure everybody's really positive about.
Independence Day.
That'll be it. What's so Farage would call it? Dear me. Okay, I think before we go and talk more about the thing we said we're not ever going to talk about, we better divert ourselves and go and do a podcast instead.
Yep.
Okay. Hello and welcome to another episode of the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow. This is episode number 75, would you believe it? Which I think we could almost call a diamond jubilee or something. There must be some metal or some jewel or something that we can claim for the 75th.
Yes.
So here we are, and every week we try and come up with something interesting or useful for owners and managers of small and medium-sized enterprises. And this week's no exception. So what do we got this week, Rich? A quick summary of what we did last 3 and then dive into it. What's this week's topic going to be? What's the headline?
I think we're going to talk about the pitfalls of power. Was that what we were?
Pitfalls of power.
The pitfalls of power.
Yeah, we're going to critique an article, or a couple of articles actually, that we've read around this subject recently, which I think might be interesting to our listeners. So quick recap then. What did we talk about last week?
Last week we talked about how much of your marketing should you outsource.
Yes, now that got a little bit of traction, not surprisingly, amongst the marketing community. They're probably either thinking, oh my goodness, should we be outsourcing my job? Or how much should I be bringing back in? I think we try to take the angle on that there's so much to do. Any internal marketing person is going to be way overloaded. So how do you get the maximum leverage? So we talked about that.
So we talked about that. Episode 73, week before, was should you be doing more R&D? And
this is R&D in the sort of soft sense, if you like. Lots of just trying new things, experimenting with new things that might turn into products. It's not the same as people imagine white coats in labs and that type of thing.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, there's nothing. That's your background. Yeah, I can imagine you doing that. Your research days as a scientist
back in the day. And then episode 72 before that was applications of AI in your business, and that was where we looked at about 50 different areas across everything from marketing, sales, finance, ops.
That's right, I remember that. We challenged owners of businesses to give them a list of questions to go to the board meeting with and ask all the different departments what they're doing.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so they were the last 3. If you haven't heard any of those, then feel free to, after this episode, dip into some of those and see what you think of those.
Yeah.
Good. So, pitfalls of power then.
Pitfalls of power.
Yeah, no, I came up with this. That reminds me of Penelope Pitstop. What was that from? Wacky Races. I don't know why that reminded me of that. So I was reading an article in the Harvard Business Review. As regular listeners will know, we often read that and maybe refer to it from time to time. And I thought they came up with quite an interesting article about the problems people have when they get a position of power, the traps as they call it. So I thought, we could critique that and see if we agree with their 5 traps and all that. But that triggered a thought that you had. which was sort of related from
Yep.
another article that you'd read.
Yeah, well, it's not so much an article, but a couple of years ago, I did a executive leadership course at Oxford Business School,
Oh yeah, I remember that.
and some of the things around that were around the whole kind of area of leadership and power.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it might be good to just maybe give a little definition of some of these things, to give it some context before we jump into the, what are the pitfalls and the traps of power. But I suppose one point to make is that power and influence are quite key attributes for effective leaders,
Mm-hmm.
but power and influence are quite different. So power is when you're kind of using force to make somebody do something, whereas influence is maybe more guided. And
is it helping other people to come to their own decision? That happens to be maybe what you want.
So one kind of way to think about this is that power helps. It gives an individual that ability to change the psychological decision making of another person.
Yeah.
By using various mechanisms. So there was a big study done.
Do we need power? Is it essential? Can the world only work by having some people in power, or is that a bit too philosophical?
Well, I suppose it's like a dance, isn't it? Somebody's got to lead. And how do you?
Because people, I can imagine a lot of people who aren't in power resent the fact that other people have got power, whether that be at the governmental level or even in the employment place.
Well, I think the interesting thing about this is that it's kind of, you get into, is it leader member or leader follower theory? Mm-hmm. Actually, with a lot of these powers, there is power that's exercised by the leader, but also the followers, for want of a better word, have power as well in each of those. So there was a big study done in the 60s or 1959 by French and Raven. That's what this is based on. And they came up with their 5 sources of power, which are legitimate power, reward power, coercive power. And these are all kind of positional. That's what's in the organization.
So what was the first one again? Legitimate power.
Reward and coercive. And then you also have expert power and referent power. So quick round the houses on that definition.
Distinguish those all apart.
So legitimate power is power that's given to somebody. You're the director of the company, so you've got power because of the organisation bestowed upon you, and
it's in a system where other people recognise that you've been given it, so they accept it and follow it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the one that we all think of.
Yeah.
First.
That's the one that it's kind of the most
you've been elected prime minister, form. Or you're the boss of a company.
Yeah. Yeah. And followers legitimise that by complying with whatever the person in power says. Okay. So do the job thing. So that's legitimate. Reward power comes from that ability of a leader to be able to reward somebody for doing a particular course of action. Again, that's kind of obvious. Someone's in charge of the pay, the bonus, the opportunities, that type of thing. So they can use that power to get certain types of behaviour if people comply.
So if you happen to have a position of authority in, I don't know, the local council that are making decisions, or you're a judge, or you're a doctor deciding on courses of treatment, you've got something to give which others want. That gives you a position of power.
Yep, and there's ways that followers can kind of influence that by, if there's an employee feedback and a reward was based on that, then other people in the organisation who maybe don't have the power can influence that kind of power.
Okay.
Coercive power kind of does what it says on the tin, really, is the way a leader uses their...
So that's the threat rather than the reward then?
Yeah.
Kind of the opposite of coercive.
Yeah, carrot and stick type of approach.
Yeah, that's the reward,
and then, so they're kind of like positional powers, and then you've got more personal power, which is where you've got expert power. So somebody who's the technical expert in the business or knows everything that's going on.
Yeah.
They can then use that power to, get certain decisions made or influence discussions. But also with this, you might find that you've got experts who aren't maybe in a organizational position of power. So someone on the shop floor who knows everything. Bob, who's been here for 30 years. So they may be consulted as part of that process by senior leaders.
They've got more power than you realise, but it's not recognised in the hierarchy.
Yeah, yeah. And then referent power is that more kind of personal, interrelational, probably more bordering on the influence side of things, where you've got a charismatic leader who brings people with them and people want to follow because they just like the person who's leading the charge type of thing.
What do you call that one?
It's referent.
So that's the charisma-led one. You just want to follow someone. This is maybe more religious or extremist politics, where people just have a belief.
And it's more kind of well, or maybe not even so such that. It's just where you're able to use persuasion and you're able to motivate people almost intrinsically to follow and to comply because of your, I don't know, maybe you walk the shop floor and you speak to everyone. You always hear those stories, don't you? Boss comes down onto the shop floor and knows everyone's names and knows all the kids' names, and people want to follow somebody like that. That is a form of soft power, I suppose.
Well, that's because they like them and they want them to succeed almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting.
So that kind of, I suppose, sets the scene a little bit for just very rapidly how power can be, the types of power that can be.
Well, maybe we should reflect on those then, as we now talk about these pitfalls, the Penelope Pitstop pitfalls of power, because they may be different then, depending on what type of power, the ones you just listed there, what type of power you've got. So just to give credit then, this is from Harvard Business Review. It's an article published this month to do with, what do they call it, the power traps?
Leadership power traps.
Leadership power traps. And this is written by Julie Diamond, Lisa Zagami, and Leslie Mones. And their biographies are in HBR. If you want to go and read them, they're all experts in behavioral psychology, and they specialise in helping women in power in particular and that type of thing. So quite interesting article and their perspectives. And they open up, it's quite interesting. This is what caught my eye really. They say the higher you rise, the funnier your jokes get. And I think that's the trap. That encompasses the whole thing.
There's a classic scene, if you ever watch Sopranos. You're a Sopranos fan?
I haven't watched Sopranos.
You haven't watched Sopranos. It's a very, not that I'm endorsing mafia or mob behaviour or anything, but it's a very interesting, that's amazing series really, looking at this particular leadership power. And there's a certain scene, and I can't remember which episode it is or which season, but where Tony Soprano tells a joke and the whole room erupts in laughter, and it just kind of, the camera sits on him as he slowly realizes that they're only laughing because he's the boss. Yeah, they're not really his friends. They're not really there for him. It's all fake. And so
Well, I suppose the opposite of that is when people lose power, suddenly realize who their friends really were.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all of that wrapped up. I think you listeners hopefully have got the gist of the fact that power is a very transient thing, and it can be very ethereal, very flimsy, but coming with it. And the point that this article is trying to make is that you can't always help it, but your behavior will change when you get into one of those positions of power, however, your list of 5. And you can't necessarily stop it happening, but at least by being aware of it, you can mitigate some of the risks around it. Yeah. So they listed 5 particular traps, as they called them, and I'd like us to discuss those 5, but I think that 5 doesn't really scratch the surface, really. There's so many, and it actually gets your thinking going on. You come up with some others then. But anyway, the 5 they come up with, they've given them all their own names. One is called the Saviour trap, being a saviour. One is complacency. One is avoidance. One is being too much of a friend. And one is stress. And I say, as soon as I started reading it, I was starting to think of others as well, which come from. So let's rattle off some of those and let's discuss their thinking, and we can critique that with our own. So the first one is the Saviour trap. And they describe this as the fact that because you've been identified as the authority, you then have the other half of that equation where you feel you have to know everything. And so therefore you get involved in everything because you feel you have to. You're just expected to know all the answers. And you end up becoming sort of overly helpful and trying to solve everybody's problems, but it could be outside your capability. It may not be anything that you necessarily have a valuable view on. There may well be other people on the team that know an awful lot more about it, but because you're the person in power, you're the boss or the leader, you both act in that way and others accept you acting in that way. And even maybe if you're wrong, or if maybe it's never quite a right wrong, it's just an opinion, but people would rather let you have your opinion and run with that rather than someone else who may have a different view.
And I suppose, just as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about it, thinking this would be interesting as well to overlay onto people's different psychological profiles. So depending on your particular, so some people really need that validation of I can solve all the problems and it's all about me or whatever. That kind of, you're probably more likely to fall into a saviour trap if that's your personality type, isn't it? Yeah, kind of, you've got those traits of kind of. So
yeah, certainly if you've got that sort of fixation on power, they're getting the buzz from it. But I think I'm also interested in the link here with the imposter syndrome, and I worry that people, lots of people suffer from imposter syndrome, and we're talking about a lot more these days. And in our clients, sometimes you can have this sort of discussion. Different people in the organisation feel it in different ways. But if you are suffering from a bit of imposter syndrome, you possibly overcompensate by trying to then prove that you're good enough for the role. Which may well exceed your ability in some places, but you sort of get away with it.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. I think it's a tricky one. How do you solve it? Be aware of it. I think just be honest with yourself. Ask a lot more questions. Try to appear to your friends the way you should be, which is being more open about stuff. And invite others to contribute. Maybe you don't speak first in a situation.
In a meeting. That's a good technique, isn't it, to use? 2
ears, 1 mouth, and all that type of thing. Just sort of let it go. So that was the first one. I thought that was quite interesting. Now, the second one is almost the opposite of this. It's what they call the complacency trap. And maybe we see this more with leaders that have been in position for longer. And they just presume that they know better than everyone else because they're in their position for a start. They've possibly had imposter syndrome way in the past, but they're well over that now. And they now are convinced in their own mind that they're the ones with all the answers. So they overplay their hand, and possibly other people don't contribute. They can miss critical information. They don't see opposing points of view. Other people can't develop beneath them because they think, oh, well, the boss is just going to make their own mind up anyway. So that's the trap they're identifying.
Well, I think that can very quickly become a self-fulfilling prophecy, that can't it? When if other people in the team or the organization realize that whatever they say isn't really going to be listened to anyway, then actually you end up with that situation where the person who's in the decision-making role just never gets challenged, and it just further cements that complacency of, well, everything's going all right, isn't it? I'm not hearing anything to the contrary. And
I think there's a real trap in there where silence is misinterpreted.
As agreement,
You and I, understanding and agreement. And you and I had an experience of that in, many, many years ago where, a conflict just disappeared, not between us, but between us and some other third party. And after a while, the conflict just fizzled out in that the discussion stopped, and it wasn't because it was resolved, but it was mistaken as having been resolved.
Yeah.
So that, I think that's a real problem. That was definitely a complacency trap situation back then. So what can you do about that other than if you're aware of it? And I think that's the problem. You're less likely to be aware of this one. I think the first one, the Saviour trap, if it is born of this imposter syndrome, you're likely to at least be looking for solutions to mitigate.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the danger with people in this complacency situation is that they're not, and maybe someone else needs to tell them, or maybe they need to do a bit of a 360 review to get some feedback.
And that can be quite a hard position to be in, because I'm just, as we're talking about this, you're just thinking about various people.
No names, please.
No names. We'll protect the guilty or the innocent, wherever they are. But it's, getting the right to break someone out of that complacency trap is actually quite hard. Again, to use another film metaphor, I think I maybe used this before. In Lord of the Rings, you must have seen Lord of the Rings.
I've seen Lord of the Rings several times. Yeah.
Well, like when the King of Rohan is under that spell, isn't he? And he's just sitting, and he's the leader, and everything's going to pot around him, isn't it? And all the good people, all the good, like the riders of Rohan, have disappeared. They've been pushed out. But then it takes a Gandalf to come in and sort of set things straight. And so in that kind of situation, you probably need a wise head, a Gandalf-esque character to come in. And
which one of your 5 leadership styles is he then? Not styles, but
well,
is he the last one? Everyone likes
who? Gandalf.
Yeah.
No, he's a bit of everything, isn't he, Gandalf? Because he's
the expert as well.
He's the expert, and he's got he can punish, he can reward, he can.
He's the all-round.
He's the all-round leader.
That Tolkien bloke, he
knew something.
So complacency trap. I think it's a dangerous one, and it needs that truth to power. Maybe this is where, not being too self-referential about it, but having a non-exec director on the board can sometimes maybe add a different perspective and take somebody to one side afterwards, especially the owner of a business.
And I think maybe if you're starting your journey of power, whatever, that sounds a bit dramatic, but if you're, then this is one to really be aware of, and maybe put those checks in early so it doesn't become a problem.
Yeah, because you probably don't get this at the beginning, do you?
No.
This is something that evolves over time.
Yeah.
And as you get busier and busier, you start dismissing other people because you're busy and you've got much more important things to do than to listen to them. Okay, so that was what Diamond, Zagami and Moniz described as the complacency trap. The avoidance trap. Now, I think this is a subtle one, and it's because with power you have autonomy, and you can decide how to spend your time. You can prioritize your own things. You can decide how long you work, where you work, how you work, who with, and on what projects, and all that sort of thing. So as a result, you suffer the risk of avoiding the things that you should be doing, but you just don't fancy.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, either because they're in your mind boring, or they might be difficult, or you delegate overly, something that you should be taking more interest in yourself, that type of thing. So that's quite an interesting one. It's maybe not one of the things you would instinctively think of like the first two. This is something that is an accidental byproduct, really, of you being able to make those decisions.
Well, I think that's always where you've got to keep in mind, lead by example, isn't it? That's where this goes off track, and it's kind of do as I say, not as I do type of
and you
leadership
talked before
approach.
about the people walking around the shop floor knowing everyone's names, but not being averse to picking up a mop and bucket and doing a bit of sweeping, or clearing away the plates after the canteen at lunch, or just doing what everybody else is expected to do.
These hands have unblocked many a toilet.
Many an office toilet, yeah. The other bit of advice they gave on this one, which I sort of want to extend a bit, is to be quite clear on what your roles and responsibilities are. Just because you've got a position of power doesn't mean that they are absolved, because you can now control what other people do through one of the 5 mechanisms you described. And for directors listening, there's a fairly clearly defined set of duties of a director. Yeah. And we throw these out every now and again in board meetings, so I'll throw them out again now, just for those directors listening, to maybe while I'm giving you this intro, they're thinking, oh gosh, do I know what my director's duties are? And if you bear these in mind, then it maybe helps put a bit of a check on some of the avoidance behaviours that you get when it's not what you want to do. And there's one in particular. But the first one is acting within your powers. And I think, okay, you've got to understand what your powers are, but you can't overstep the mark. Some things are reserved matters for shareholders. Other things need votes and, what's your authority limit and that sort of thing. You've got to promote the success of a company, and I don't think that's particularly challenging. I think most directors will accept that they're there to promote the success of the company, although sometimes there's conflicts of interest, and that's a third bit. You've got to watch out for that. The one that I'm more worried about people, not directors anyway, not properly exercising, is their independent judgment. It's a duty of all directors to exercise independent judgment, which means that in a board meeting, you can't just take as read the fact that someone else has looked into a problem and it's okay. Collectively, as a board of directors, you are collectively responsible, with the one slight exception that a finance director carries a bit more of an onus on having some financial expertise, but it doesn't stop the others needing to know about that bit. And the other one is using reasonable care, skill and diligence. Once again, I think sometimes leaders can get a bit cavalier with things because they think, oh, I'm the boss, it doesn't matter if I make a mistake, I can get away with it. So I think maybe that's the, in terms of what the authors of this thing put down as the solutions for the avoidance trap, I think maybe that referring to your responsibilities, your budget accountabilities maybe, or whatever you've promised to whoever higher up, a shareholder or whatever, be aware of that.
Yep.
So that was the avoidance trap.
So the next one is the friend trap.
Yeah, this is... I think this is more common than, I don't know, is it more common than people think? It's quite common, I think. And it happens a lot where two peers are maybe, getting on quite well with each other and one of them gets promoted. So that happens. The other situation where that hasn't been the way it's come about, but nevertheless there's a power relationship between a manager and a subordinate. And even if you might try to not do this, there's an instinct which for the subordinate wants to befriend the boss, because it gives them a sense of security if they're feeling a little bit closer. So if if the chips are down and something is going wrong, you want to have a little bit of a friendship protecting you and maybe get some inside information or advance notice of things. And so there's certainly the temptation on the part of the subordinate to befriend the boss. And I think there's a bit of a temptation the other way around as well, because bosses, depending how they're feeling with their imposter syndrome, are sometimes falling into the trap of wanting to be liked too much. Bosses have to make some difficult decisions sometimes, and they have to remain distant from these sort of friendships. But because of that natural human instinct to want everybody to admire you and like you, and that fifth one on your list, I think so. There's this draw on both sides of the equation of a subordinate wanting to, befriend the boss to get some sort of favourable treatment or advance notice of things going wrong, and then the other way around. So there's a real tricky one here.
And you see that this, you see it. It's a really hard thing for someone to almost move through an organisation as well and make that break if you started on the shop floor or at that level, and then you've worked your way up and worked your way through. You've almost got to have a kind of epoch-defining moment almost to say, well, now I was this, and I recognise everybody at that level, but now I'm doing this role, and that's different, and things can't be the same
Yeah, no, you're right. You see it on the shop floor when team leaders become supervisors become managers. They talk about this sort of crossing the line, and it's very hard then to go out for a pint with your mates or still play footy with them after work on a Thursday, and then the next morning, you might be in a disciplinary with one of them or doing something quite tricky. So it's a really hard thing to do. I had the similar thing when I moved to different companies, and I went back to a company, and I was then the manager of someone who used to be my manager. So it flipped. And I think the only advice I can give in these sort of situations is to be very open about this and discuss it with the subordinates involved. So maybe it's not all of them, but just say, look, things have changed. I've got different responsibilities now, and this is really bad. But I can't do that thing that we used to do, or I can't give you that information you're asking for. And I'm afraid we've got to put a bit of professional distance between us. I
think as well with this is maybe this is a bit philosophical, but just. The role is the role. It's different to your value as a person. So I think sometimes, depending on how you think about these things, there's almost a lot of my self-worth is linked to my position in a company or something, or I'm better than someone if I'm more senior, or that type of thing.
Yeah.
And I think if you can dissolve that and say, well, no, this is just a role that we do, and approach it with humility, then that can help with this type of friend trap scenario. And it's good authentic leadership practice anyway.
Yeah, I think you're right. If you're able to practice that, and it should be the right thing to do. But it's a trap that some people inevitably get tempted by. Even, at an extreme, a relationship between a manager and a subordinate. And lots of companies have provisions for that in their employee handbook, don't they? And you have to move departments. They can't stop it happening, but you can't remain in that relationship of subordinate and manager if you're in a relationship. And it seems to be that power is seen by some as being quite alluring, and if you lose that power, that allure goes away. So many examples of that have there been of that in like politics, for example, with affairs and that sort of thing. So a real one to watch for there, and it does happen inevitably when somebody's moving through an organisation, because they have to then manage their friends. And that's a tricky one. So that was the fourth one that they put in their list. And then the one they finished with, and I think this is, as I say, just starting to get the thinking going really on the whole topic, but the stress trap.
Right.
And I think a lot of managers, leaders, people in power will have experienced this through different reasons or another. Maybe it's a fear of failure, and you feel you just got to do everything.
Yep, expectation.
On the back of that imposter syndrome again, you think, I've just been given this role, I've now got to have inbox zero. I've got to have all my meetings, and you end up before you know it. And I've been here before in a previous job where your whole week is taken up in meetings because everybody wants a piece of you. And 1 minute your quality people are demanding you, and the next minute the finance people are demanding you, and you can't really think of a way of saying no to any one of them because they're all individually important things.
Yeah.
But when you add it all up, it means you've got no time left to actually do your job. So I think the only solution to this is to accept the fact that you can't do everything. Come up with some very clear priorities, have a clear North Star, and you talked about authentic leadership, and then either delegate stuff that can be delegated or just admit that you're not going to get that done. That's going to have to wait for another time.
Yeah, I mean, I started experimenting with time boxing. I think there's different techniques, isn't it? Maybe moving into solutions.
Pomodoro technique as well, the whole 40 minutes thing.
Just kind of, try different things, isn't it? To figure out there's no silver bullet with this stuff. You've got to try a few things.
There's a lot of self-discipline, try and sit down at the beginning of the day, work out what are the important things to get done today. And then inevitably things will come along and distract you from that and interrupt you, that phone call that comes out of the blue. So when that happens, maybe you've got to develop some techniques to manage the stress. Go for a walk, do some deep breathing, take some time out, work from home. However you do it, everyone's got to find their own. But there's a real trap here, and I think it's a shame. You see a lot of people going into it. Hopefully then they come out the other side of it once they've got a bit better of a balance, and it needs supportive managers the next level above as well to not just expect everything. And I've worked in some pretty aggressive American-owned firms, and not to say that all American firms are like this, but with a very quarter-to-quarter shareholder-led expectation of performance, there's a lot of stress at the higher levels. And I was never there, but I can see how they then passed the stress down to the next level and down to the next level. So that by the time it got down to my level, you were sort of experiencing secondhand the stress that was several levels above you, and everybody was just expected to run around like blue-ass flies. Tricky one, that. So prioritize, delegate, and admit that you can't do everything. So they're the 5 that they came up with. And then it just started getting me to thinking, Well, there's loads more things that can pull you down or make it hard when you're a leader. One, I think, was hubris. You know, you do need a bit of humility.
Yeah.
And just ask everybody else, what do you think? You know, whenever you are tempted to make a decision, hold back and ask other people, and admit that you don't have all the answers. I think there's a real danger that you sort of play the role of being a leader, and you've got this image in your mind from films and so on that leaders always get everything right and know everything, and that's never the case.
Well, it's crazy, and if you think about it, you think, well, if you're expecting yourself, or even if you're not the leader and you're looking at your leaders thinking they've got to be right 100% of the time on everything, no matter what the circumstance. I mean, it's just such an unrealistic expectation.
And yet we expect it of our political leaders, of our school leaders. You know, nothing should go wrong. Our business leaders. Very difficult to do.
Well, don't get me onto cultural, you know, entitlement and a lot of that. That's where a lot of that leads from, isn't it? It's like the customer's never wrong. It's like all these types of things lead and put that pressure onto people, whether it's teachers or political leaders or business leaders or leaders in anything. You know, it's this kind of, we have this expectation now that everything should be instant, everything should be right first time, everything should be convenient, and it's just, life doesn't work that way.
No, and yet as a leader, then on the other side of that, you soak that up rather than just admitting that we're all human. So I think the part of that is admitting mistakes. And I think there's one of the traps I would have put much higher up in their list is that as a leader, you resist admitting mistakes, and yet you've got to embrace that. If you need everybody else to be able to do that, we've got to celebrate our mistakes as long as they lead to learning. And if the leader themselves don't, you know, if they say to everybody else, own up to your mistakes and I won't, you know, judge you as long as we learn from it, but I won't own up to mine, then you're not leading by example, are you? You're not going to get others doing the same. Just make everything transparent. I think there's a danger that you leave things quite opaque because that gives you room to a bit of wiggle room, maybe places to hide, places to cover. You don't necessarily have to explain your thinking all the time. If you haven't been open about it, you can just say, well, I've taken lots of things into consideration and this is my view. It just builds distrust. You know, how do I know that, you know, my opinion has properly been taken into account, or have you considered such and such? So that's a biggie.
And something I think as well and I think maybe this is another, I don't know what this would be called, but I think when you're in a position where you are a decision maker, you are a leader, and say you're in a meeting and you've got all the facts and stuff, and you come out of that meeting and everyone else is sitting around thinking, what was going on in there? What was being said? How was that? Because you get used to having context all the time, it's very easy for you to say, oh, we were just talking about X, Y, Z. It's nothing important, but you know. But from everyone else's perspective, it's like, well, what on earth was going on? How? And I think that, I don't know, the trap of familiarity or something, I'd maybe call it. You know the context, you know what's going on, and you take for granted, rightly or wrongly, the fact that other people don't. Yeah. And so that can then, it's almost...
well, that maybe relates to the Patrick Lencioni thing about trust, you know, the 5 dysfunctions of a team fella. And if you haven't got the trust there, then people start thinking, well, what were they talking about? Or you know, might that be good for me or bad for me? What do I have to worry about that? Yeah. Why am I excluded? You can't have everybody involved in all discussions all the time. That's not how organizations work. You know, you've got to be able to delegate and divide. But, you know, the biggest one that, you know, as I was going through the list, I thought this has caught me out on a number of occasions and still does to this day, is when you're just, as a leader, shooting the breeze. You're just discussing some ideas, maybe with another leader or even with a subordinate. It doesn't matter, just a colleague. And the people hearing that misinterpret that as an instruction. And that's not what you intended at all. You just think, I wonder if, you know, what would that happen? And your mind's moved on. You just assume that everybody else is left with the I wonder if thought as well, and they've gone and had a coffee and got on with their day job. But without you knowing it, someone has picked up on that, and they're now devoting, you know, large parts of their time to work on this thing because they think that's what you want. When actually all you were doing was just having a bit of a chat.
And that's why we've got an alpaca farm in the office. So that's where that came from now.
That's what the smell was. Where do they hide them?
No, but it's true. And I think that relates back to that previous point, is that you kind of, and maybe this is as well how people think and external processing and all of that. And I think it's that power dynamic of our people interpreting that as instruction rather than inspiration or just ideas that are just kind of, you know, it's...
Well, maybe it's lack of clarity as to what their goals are meant to be. Or back to when we were talking about the R&D episode a couple of weeks ago, you know, the Google famous 20% thing. People have always got a bit of slack if you choose to make it, and they're trying to find other things to do to further the organisation. So they're trying to pick off little bits of things that you say, trying to take that as inspiration, as ideas for what to do. But it can be dangerous. And I saw that when I used to manage hundreds of people in a factory environment. You could just say something quite off the cuff, and it goes round the shop floor like wildfire, and everybody thinks, oh my goodness, this is happening, or Dave thinks that, and you think nothing of the sort. You just made a comment.
Yeah.
And you see that now with sound bites and social media and politics, don't you? Someone makes an off-the-cuff comment, off mic, maybe in a radio studio, and before you know it, the whole scandal's erupted from it, and all sorts. So yeah, I think there's so many pitfalls in being a leader and having power. I found your open air quite interesting as well. The sort of the ways you get power legitimate and all that stuff.
Yeah. Very
interesting. So whilst it started out as a bit of a critique of the HBR, the Harvard Business Review article, I think that generated quite a lot of thought. So I hope people listening have just reflected on maybe their own leadership positions and how they exercise their power, and at least if nothing else, be aware of these various traps. Some of them they will no doubt be already, and perhaps just talk about it. Find someone that you can talk to about that, either in an official company capacity, a colleague, non-exec, or someone outside of work.
I managed to make it all the way through the episode without referencing He-Man.
Until now.
Because, of course, he had the power.
He did have the power. Yes.
So,
cultural reference.
There we go.
You've just lost our younger listeners.
Well,
they won't remember.
Sure.
Or has it been resurfaced with a cartoon or something?
I don't know, but you can't beat that 80s classic.
You can't beat it. That's great.
She-Ra and not She-Ra. What was his cat name?
You've lost me now.
Remember.
It's a long way to go for me.
A normal cat, Battle
Cat.
That's when the power came. He was Battle Cat, but before that, he was called something else.
I think that's a perfect place to end this week's podcast.
As I fade off into the distance, reminiscing about nostalgia.
Fade his microphone down quick. He's off on one. He's in one of these traps. We just found it. So thank you very much for listening and watching maybe to another episode of the SME Growth Podcast, our episode number 75. Every week we try and come up with some interesting and useful stuff for business leaders and owners and managers, and hopefully that's been a good one today as well if you're in a position of power or leadership somewhere or another. Please pass on word of what we're doing and help us on our continuing journey to increase the listenership of this mighty fine podcast. Thank you very much, and good luck with your business.